Hey, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to do a review of all the information that we've covered on the road to the American Revolution. It's a lot of information, and I want to make sure that you're ready for your test. So hang on tight. Here we go. I want to start off by reminding you about the word monopoly and that it means the possession or control of the trade or making and selling of a certain product. And in this case, we're talking about Great Britain and how they had control over the sugar trade in the colonies. Speaking of sugar, our first act is the Sugar Act, and that was a tax that was placed on our sugar imports and also on coffee and wine. And molasses, remember, kind of is put in together with sugar because it's a sweetener. And this had two reasons for this act. The first was to raise money to pay for the French and Indian War, and the other reason was to give the sugar growers in the West Indies a monopoly on sugar in the colonies. So it was making Great Britain some money. Then we have the Stamp Act, which was a law that was passed by Parliament that taxed the colonists for their paper items like newspapers and almanacs, playing cards, licenses, and deeds. This was a tax that made the colonists very, very angry. They didn't like the Sugar Act, but when they put the Stamp Act on there as well, it really enraged them, and they were ending up with riots and things like that going on during this time. They repealed both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act and replaced it, however, with the Townshend Acts. This was an act that taxed things like tea, paper, lead, and paint, and other things like glass that were imported into the American colonies, things they couldn't make on their own or get there locally yet. The colonists didn't like this, and this led to two events. One is the Boston Massacre, which, remember, happened on King Street in Boston, and we have this group of colonists who are taunting British soldiers. The soldiers end up firing into the crowd and killing 5 men and injuring 6 others. And the other event was the Boston Tea Party, which was the act of rebellion. It was basically it was against the tea tax part of the Townshend Acts. And our Boston citizens dressed up like Indians and dumped 3 shiploads of tea into the Boston harbor. And remember, that was 342 cases of tea that they dumped into the harbor and ruined. And this really made Great Britain very, very angry. And so in response to this, Great Britain passed the Intolerable Acts. And the Intolerable Acts were a series of laws, not really taxes, but restrictions that were placed on the colonists, and it was all to punish them for the rebellion that they had showed during the Boston Tea Party. They closed the Boston harbor. They didn't allow the colonists to have the elected officials. They had the Quartering Act, which I need to say very clearly so that you know what I'm talking about, which allowed the British soldiers to stay with colonists without paying them. They also did things like take the criminals to Great Britain to be tried rather than trying them in Massachusetts, where they had been doing all the trials for criminals in the colonies. So the Intolerable Acts were named the Intolerable Acts because the colonists they weren't going to tolerate it. So in response to that, we have the First Continental Congress, which was a group of the representatives from 12 of the colonies that met together, and they decided to boycott things from England. They talked about their rights as British citizens and the complaints that they had against the king, and they decided to contact the king about these issues. Now remember, the only colony that was not represented here was, in fact, Georgia. They were kind of not sure they were ready to jump on that bandwagon and really get into addressing the king and rebelling yet. I want to summarize the 5 main reasons for colonial rebellion for you now. We went over this in class. There's a foldable in your interactive notebook about this as well, if you remember. I believe it's orange. And I want to just kind of go through this again, just to refresh your memory and really get that in there so that you remember. The first one was the Proclamation of 1763. The colonists were not allowed to move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, some of them had already sort of gone over there anyway. They had to move back. if they wanted to move over, that law prevented them from doing so. And remember that the Proclamation of 1763 was the first time that Great Britain had really restricted their movement in the colonies and really told them, no, you can't do this. The proclamation line is right down here. If you look at the mouse, I believe it has a yellow circle around it. And the proclamation line goes right down here through this mountain range, which I really like this map because you can see that that Appalachian mountain range goes all the way through all of those 13 colonies, all the way down here into the edge of Georgia. So the Proclamation of 1763 happened right after the French and Indian War. So we end the war, and the first thing that happens is the king says, no, you cannot move over there. And that really, really led to the beginning of the dissatisfaction that the colonists had with Great Britain. The next thing is these endless British taxes. And we talked in class about all the things that were taxed. And we just talked about in the video here all the things that were taxed with the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and the Townshend Act. And the colonists didn't really know, what else was going to be taxed. Was there ever going to be an end to any of this? They had no say-so in what was being taxed and how much it was taxed and whether it was going to be taxed forever. They took away the Sugar and the Stamp Act and they replaced it with the Townshend Act. And so there were a lot of other taxes. You guys have to realize that we didn't even talk about in class. These are just the main ones that we hit on. There were a few others, as some of you have discovered during your research for our timeline. The next one is the no representation in Parliament. Remember, this is probably the biggest reason that they were upset with Great Britain. And the reason is because with no say-so in their government, they didn't feel like they were considered British citizens. In Great Britain, if you were a citizen there, you had a representative in Parliament, but no one was there representing the colonists. And so taxes were being passed, laws were being passed without the colonists having a voice in their government at all. And this was very upsetting. So this is probably the main reason that we see rebellion. The next one was resentment towards the colonial governor. The colonial governor was really disliked because his job was just to enforce the laws that the king and Parliament put out there for the colonies. They did not have the colonists' best interest at heart. They didn't care about whether or not the colonists were happy. Their job was to follow the king's orders. And so they became more and more angry or resentful towards the colonial governors. And then finally, they had strict control over the colonial legislature. The colonists were allowed to make their own laws for quite a while at the beginning of their settlement over here. And after the French and Indian War, the whole goal of Great Britain was to control decision-making in the colonies. And that's because they didn't want the colonists making decisions that were going to go against what the king wanted. The king would lose money, the king would lose power, and Great Britain's whole entire goal at this point was to become very powerful. So they had to take over the colonies and keep the colonies from having any control over legislature and decision making. So these are the 5 reasons that we see that cause the rebellion in the colonies. The last thing I want to do with you guys is just go through my Road to the Revolution timeline again, just to make sure that you understand the order that things happened. Knowing the order that things happened is important because sometimes they build on each other, especially around this time when we're building up to the Revolutionary War. Knowing what happened when is a valid thing to know. So let's go through this real quick. Our first event was the French and Indian War. Remember, this was the war fought between Great Britain and the French and Indians. They fought because they had a long-time rivalry. They were disputing over the land that we now know as the Ohio River Valley. Great Britain won the war and gained all those lands in North America from the Mississippi River all the way to the east to the Atlantic Ocean and much of Canada. This included Florida as well, because we gained that from Spain. It totally kicked France out of North America almost completely. Then right after that, we have the Proclamation of 1763, which I did not put on this timeline. Then after the Proclamation of 1763, in order to get money to pay for the French and Indian War, we see 1764 was the Sugar Act. And this act taxed sugar, molasses, wine, and coffee. Now, obviously, we weren't getting enough money to pay for the war and maintain all those British troops in the colonies, because that's the second reason for taxes. The first one was to gain money to pay for the war. The second reason was to make sure that they could maintain their British troops in the colonies. And so we add on to that the Stamp Act. This tax was for paper products like licenses, deeds, almanacs, playing cards, and newspapers, and made the colonists mad, and they ended up rioting about this. Then we see the Townshend Acts replaced the Sugar and Stamp Acts and taxed tea, lead, paint, paper, glass, and the colonists decided to boycott this act, and this happened in 1767. Then after that, we have the Boston Massacre, which happened in 1770 on King Street, where we see 5 killed and 6 wounded. Following that, we have the Boston Tea Party in 1773. Remember, this was a rebellion where they dressed like Indians and dumped 342 cases of tea into the Boston Harbor. And in response to that, we have the Intolerable Acts. These acts were in response to the Boston Tea Party, and they closed the harbor, didn't allow legislation, and in the colonies had criminals tried in Great Britain, and imposed the Quartering Act. Then in 1774, we have the First Continental Congress. Colonists from 12 of the colonies gathered together to unite in petitioning the king for their rights, boycotting British goods, and gaining representation in Parliament. That was their goal. After that, we have war begins. We're going to talk about this when we come back from the break, and we are also going to talk about the Declaration of Independence. So that takes us down the road to the American Revolution, and I hope that helped to help you remember all of those things, helps you to fill out your study guide, and helps prepare you for your test tomorrow. And when we get back from our break, we are going to dive right into the American Revolution and talk about this war that changed the history of our country and made our country into a country to the present. So I hope that helped you, and we'll talk to you guys soon. Bye.